Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Tonight, school's out for the summer.
I'm just not going to risk it.
Millions of kids out of class and without daycare for now, leaving parents needing to work with tough choices.
There's a lot of anxiety because I don't want to put my kids at risk.
I'm Andrew Chang. Also tonight, reopening hits the gym.
Happy to be back and doing something physical.
Fitness centers open their doors in BC, but your workout won't look the same. Growing tributes and growing questions. What could have caused that deadly snowbirds crash?
What are you looking for when you see that video?
A silver lining to the lockdown. Global emissions are falling.
We're seeing how there's a different way to do things. Do we really have to commute an hour each way?
Lessons from a pandemic in the fight against climate change. This is The National. For a lot of people tonight who are itching to get into their favorite stores, restaurants, or hair salons, the wait is finally over.
Ontario, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan all saw big reopenings today, but in Ontario, home to about 2 million students, a major closure to schools for the rest of the academic year.
I'm just not going to chance it. I'm just not going to chance it when it comes to our kids.
With that announcement, news that overnight summer camps are also being canceled. And it all comes as many more people head back to work in Ontario. Stage one of the province's reopening did begin today. Not included in that, daycares, which means parents will be keeping their very young kids at home for now. And as Deanna Sumanak-Johnson shows us, what it all adds up to is quite the predicament.
While Ontario's schools are out until September, daycares could reopen in a matter of weeks. For parents waiting to be called back to the office,
My work has already told us that they are beginning to phase in people to return back to work starting June 1st.
that's both too soon and not soon enough.
There's a lot of anxiety because I don't want to put my kids at risk. And with me going into the office, I could be subjected, increasing that risk.
I'm just not going to risk it.
That same balancing act leading the Premier to make the decision today to cancel school until September, along with overnight summer camps and place restrictions on day camps. He says daycares will reopen in stage 2, but provided no date. Parents of this 3-year-old say working from home while taking care of a toddler has been tough on them and her.
It's difficult not to be able to give your, the full input or your full ability into a meeting because, your child is there and she could flare up at any moment.
But they're just as nervous about eventually sending her back to daycare.
I'm kind of cautious in that regard where I'd want to wait it out for a couple of weeks after they announce that we can go back, just to see how things go.
The Minister of Education says precautions will be taken before daycares reopen.
No more than 50 people per center. Every staffer has to be screened.
But this child care advocate and mom of a toddler says there's plenty more that remains unanswered.
We're going to have smaller group sizes. Well, how does that work when a childcare center has a limited amount of space? Are some families able to come back and other ones aren't?
Tough questions as families try to balance the need for their children's safety, socialization, and perhaps their own sanity one day at a time. Deanna Sumanak-Johnson, CBC News, Toronto.
Today, Ontario saw a jump in new COVID cases, 427. That is the highest number in more than a week, and it underscores the need for caution as many more stores reopen today. As Jacqueline Hansen shows us, that was a slow, careful task.
Altogether, it's 94-24.
At this record store, masks and plexiglass separate customers from staff and each other.
It's surreal. I am still getting used to it.
Ontario retailers with street access are now allowed to let a limited number of customers into their stores, one person per 4 square meters.
We felt that was going to be way too tight in here, so we've gone to even less than that.
Instead of 70 people, Sonic Boom Records is letting in just 15. A gradual reopening it's comfortable with, and it seems so are customers.
Pretty much everyone's wearing a mask. I think everyone is self-consciously keeping their distance from one another, so yeah, it feels pretty comfortable.
Good afternoon, Arietta Boutique.
At this women's clothing store, some new ways of doing business.
We have a new doorway set up on our change room that is able to be wiped down where we used to have a curtain.
plus an online appointment booking system to manage the number of customers coming in. Because the store is small, it's one at a time.
I think that makes them feel really comfortable and safe, and it makes me feel safe that the staff are being protected by, having only one person in the store at a time.
But the Retail Council of Canada estimated only about half of Ontario's stores would reopen today.
There are a lot of retailers who are in malls, especially in Ontario, where all the malls are closed.
Retailers inside malls have missed out on both curbside pickup and now phase 1 of reopening.
It is like an apocalypse for many of our retailers. They have no sales.
But even on Main Street, business will depend on customers coming back, and not everyone's ready.
I'm probably going to stick with like curbside pickup, that kind of thing. I think it's just a little bit too soon.
The province's first wave of retailers challenged to prove that reopening safely is possible. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, as we mentioned, Saskatchewan and British Columbia also allowed many more businesses to reopen today. In Saskatchewan, hairstylists can now open, as can retail stores with new rules in place. In BC, which saw just 2 new COVID cases today, restaurants are on the list. They're able to open their dining rooms, but are spacing people apart and using disposable menus. Now, also opening in that province, some fitness facilities. Yes, people are hitting the gym again, so long as they meet requirements to prevent the spread of the virus. Greg Rasmussen found out what a pandemic workout looks like.
It's back to the gym, but with conditions.
So you go straight to the bathroom, okay, if you can.
There's hand washing and equipment is cleaned before the workouts can begin.
Like 10 on one leg, and then you're gonna switch.
Clients have a set space, and the trainer keeps back too.
Like a lot of times people thought personal training was like we're touching no, you're not. You don't have to.
The owner hopes the precautions will be enough.
A little bit of like nervousness still, but it's like more of an excited nervousness, I guess, because we've done what we can. You're like this, okay?
Many of his clients switch to online personal training, but prefer being at the gym.
For me, I think it's really important to stay physically active, and so being a part of this gym and this community is worth that risk.
Happy to be back and doing something physical and getting my mind off everything that's been going on.
For group activities, it's more complicated. Take spin classes, usually done in tight clusters. This Vancouver company was swamped with demand when it announced it was reopening, but it's had to relocate to a warehouse to accommodate physical distancing.
So we've introduced the comeback tour, and we sold out within 5 minutes in Vancouver for the first week, and waitlist is through the roof.
Officials say transmission rates have gone down enough in BC for gyms and other businesses to reopen.
It's the new normal. We can do things, we can go back to doing things that we did before, but in a different way.
For business owners, different means fewer customers at one time and less profit. Despite restrictions being eased, many fitness centers in BC remain shuttered, including those run by local governments. But for enthusiasts, today's move is welcome.
To come back here and even just to see people, even if they're 6 feet away, it's just nice.
With hopes, this test works. Greg Rasmussen, CBC News, Port Moody, BC.
Now, one thing that won't be reopening, the Canada-US border. Restrictions are staying in place for another month. The ban on non-essential travel has been extended until June 21st, and Prime Minister Trudeau says he's looking into what will happen after that. Potential measures could include tracking travelers and isolating people where necessary. The border is still open to trade and essential workers.
The Prime Minister also addressed Sunday's Canadian snowbirds crash, promising to reach out to the people affected.
I will, of course, be speaking to the family of Captain Casey and others. There is going to be a proper investigation, and we're going to allow them to do their work before we make assumptions.
So for their part, investigators caution that work will take time, but they do describe Sunday's incident as a worst-case scenario turned worst nightmare, adding Captains Jen Casey and Richard McDougall would only have ejected if they had no other option. Briar Stewart is in Kamloops tonight with more on the search for understanding what happened.
At a growing memorial outside the airport, Canada's Minister of Defence, along with members of the Snowbirds, came to remember and pay tribute to Captain Jen Casey.
Having this display demonstrates to them how much we appreciate what they do for all of us.
Nearby at the crash site, Air Force investigators are focused on the wreckage still strewn across lawns, trying to piece together what led up to this. No! No!
What are you looking for when you see that video?
David McNair is a former investigator with the Transportation Safety Board.
But I listened to hear if I could hear the airplane that was climbing, and if you expect it was climbing, you'd have an engine increase of thrust. Didn't hear that, so I'm wondering if there was some sort of engine problem.
Robert Mitchell is a former commander of the Snowbirds and still flies in air shows. He knew Casey personally.
You know, it's obviously horrific and tragic, and you don't often think of one of the passengers in an airplane and the Snowbirds being hurt like this and are killed.
Mitchell says it was not uncommon for the public affairs officer and a mechanic to ride in the jets in transit. On Sunday, pilot Captain Richard McDougall and Captain Casey were on their way to Vancouver Island. Mitchell says each would have had to pull their own ejection handle, and officials confirmed they both ejected before the crash. As for the safety of the Tudor jets, which were originally manufactured in the 1960s, Mitchell says he has no concerns.
I would go get in that jet today and fly it. I have thousands of hours flying the Tudor jet with the Snowbirds and even in pilot training, and I never question the airplane.
Officials say the jets are checked before each takeoff, and every 2 years they're essentially torn apart and rebuilt. But something did go horribly wrong, and it could take a year for the investigation to be complete. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Kamloops.
A U.S. Navy submersible will be assisting in the search for the Canadian military helicopter that crashed last month off of Greece.
We would attempt to find and recover both our fallen and the machine, to bring both our shipmates and aircrew home, and to maximize the chances to fully understand what happened.
6 crew were on board a Cyclone helicopter, which went down during a training mission. Only the remains of Lieutenant Abigail Cobra and Captain Brendanine McDonald have been retrieved.
A newly unsealed court document is revealing more about that horrific mass shooting spree in rural Nova Scotia last month. Among the new details, that several locals had considered the gunman deeply unstable and potentially dangerous. Kayla Hounsell has more on what police learned and when.
It was here on his property that Gabriel Wortman had barrels of lime and acid and talked about different ways of getting rid of a body, one witness told police. The RCMP has not said whether they found any chemicals. The information is contained in an application put together by police to get a search warrant for the gunman's properties. It is partially redacted, but it reveals several witnesses told police the gunman was intelligent but paranoid. One specifically said he was paranoid about the pandemic. That person also said the gunman was a psychopath and that he had been severely abused as a young boy. Another witness said the gunman wasn't a police officer wannabe, rather he didn't like police officers and thought he was better than them. Wortman burned several vehicles and structures. The documents reveal that after the shooting spree, multiple people reported the gunman had recently purchased $800 worth of gasoline. His common-law spouse said she saw him pour gasoline on his cottage, a warehouse, and several of his vehicles. The documents also shed light on a survivor's story. People reported an RCMP car, or what they thought was an RCMP car, pulled up beside their vehicle. They rolled down the window, but before they could say anything, the driver started shooting. One was hit. Both were able to get away and told police arriving at the scene that a person driving what looked like an RCMP cruiser had shot at them. Police didn't tell the public about that car until after 10 o'clock the next morning. Kayla Hounsell, CBC News, Halifax.
Terror charges have been laid tonight in a Toronto murder case. A woman was killed in a February machete attack at a massage parlor, and police say the suspect was inspired by an ideology of hatred against women. Ellen Morrow looks at the significance of this new charge.
This is where 24-year-old Ashley Noel Arzaga was killed, a loving mother to a young daughter and now a victim of terrorism, says the RCMP.
This crime was, in fact, one in which the accused was inspired by the violent extremist movement commonly known as incel.
And so today, the charges against the 17-year-old male suspect in the February stabbing at a Toronto massage parlor were upgraded. The first time an alleged incel-inspired killing has been formally labeled as terrorism by police.
We need to name things properly in order to deal with them well and make a kind of a path towards ending this kind of violence.
Incel means involuntary celibate, a largely online movement linked to misogynist attacks.
And they really espouse an intense and extreme hatred towards women. They have grievances with our society in terms of what they see as unequal access to women's sex relationships.
It's the same ideology allegedly behind the Toronto van attack that killed 10 people and injured 16 others in 2018. But despite incel-related social media posts, the suspect in that case was not charged with terrorism. Neither was the man convicted of killing 6 Muslim worshippers at a Quebec City mosque in 2017.
It kind of defies logic to think that what he did was not a terrorist activity.
That seeming reluctance to press terrorism charges in cases not linked to extremist groups like ISIS makes today's developments particularly significant, says this law professor.
It is a bold step, it is a novel step, but it is one that, in my view, is long overdue.
There are fears the incel movement is growing, flourishing on the web, making future real-world attacks against women an ever-present threat. Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, Donald Trump is doubling down on his choice to take an unproven drug to fight COVID-19.
That was a phony study, and it's very dangerous to do it.
Up next, what the U.S. president revealed about why he started taking it.
And the monster storm putting millions in danger, bracing for a super cyclone in the middle of a pandemic.
And with everyone locked up, emissions are down, but can it last?
Do we really have to commute an hour each way?
We're back in 2. Welcome back. Another Canadian retailer has fallen victim to COVID-19. This time, women's fashion chain Reitmans. The Montreal-based company already had financial problems, and now it's struggling even more to pay its bills. Today, it filed for creditor protection and will undergo restructuring. It has 576 stores across Canada, including Reitmans, Pennington's, RW & Co., Additionelle, and Time Maternity. Johnson & Johnson says it'll stop selling its talc-based baby powder in Canada and the U.S. The company faced thousands of lawsuits that said the powder caused cancer. Johnson & Johnson says it remains confident in the safety of the product, but that lower demand, along with manufacturing restrictions caused by the pandemic, fueled their decision. Well, Donald Trump was defending his use of hydroxychloroquine today. That's a malaria drug that has not been proven to fight COVID-19. And as the CBC's Susan Ormiston tells us, the U.S. president also seemed to change his story about his potential exposure to the virus.
The little pill, a workhorse fighting off malaria for 40 years and helping with lupus. But in a fight against coronavirus, unproven.
So, welcome to our cabinet meeting. And
still again today, Trump defended taking it.
I thought as a frontline defense, possibly it would be good, and I've had no impact from it.
The FDA has warned against taking hydroxychloroquine outside hospitals.
That was a phony study.
We've got to get life back to normal.
And when his health secretary tried to explain a current U.S. study still underway.
And that data is still pending, but...
And it's got, well, it's got very good reviews. Very good from many, many doctors.
Trump cut him off. We did learn the president opted to pop the pills after his valet got COVID-19.
I also had a case where we had somebody fairly close to me, very nice young gentleman, he tested positive.
Your valet.
When that happened 2 weeks ago, Trump said this.
I've had very little personal contact with this gentleman.
Vice President Mike Pence's press secretary also tested positive, but Pence confirmed he's not taking the drug. A confusing smokescreen for a pill which is now politically toxic.
He's our president, and I would rather he not be taking something that has not been approved by the scientists, especially in his age group and in his, shall we say, weight group.
Pelosi is a sick woman. She's got a lot of problems, a lot of mental problems.
A taste of what's to come as Trump champions nearly 50 states in partial reopening by this weekend and turns his eye to his re-election campaign, trying to banish the darkness and the threat of this pandemic. Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Washington.
India and Bangladesh are bracing for a cyclone so powerful from the Bay of Bengal that officials are urging 500,000 people to go inland for shelter. But as Chris Brown tells us, coronavirus is making evacuations so much more complicated.
When the super typhoon hits, who knows if the sandbags and improvised seawalls will really make any difference to these low-lying villages. The storm surge could be over 5 meters high. From eastern India to the low, marshy areas of Bangladesh, authorities over a vast region urged more than 5 million people to seek shelter. Some of those shelters are being hastily converted from facilities that house patients with COVID-19.
It is cyclone in the time of COVID.
The head of India's Natural Disaster Response Force stressed a storm like this at a time like this is unprecedented. Having to choose between the virus or the storm, this woman says she feared the cyclone more. Authorities worry many others may not make the same calculation and stay in their homes, putting themselves at grave risk. Others have no place to go. Directly in the storm's path are refugee camps that house more than 1.3 Rohingya Muslims who were forced out of Myanmar. Canadian Dr. Fawzia Alvi has visited the region frequently as part of a Nobel-nominated humanitarian effort.
Those bamboo and tar tents, temporary dwellings, they're not going to hold those cyclone at all. There is no way it's going to worsen the already poor sanitation system. So it's going to worsen the spread of this coronavirus as well as other communicable diseases.
The region, of course, has frequently suffered catastrophic loss of life from huge storms. But this Canadian aid veteran says there's also been a big learning curve, which gives him hope this time.
The combination of national governments being better prepared and the aid agencies being better prepared, it saves more lives.
Still, Cyclone Amphan was ranked as the most powerful storm ever in the Bay of Bengal, though its winds have lessened slightly. Chris Brown, CBC News, Vancouver.
Ahead tonight, Bob McDonald is here to answer your science questions about the pandemic. Next, though, the lockdown has driven emissions down, but is it enough to make a difference?
And later, the story behind this. A few squirrels and a very bored, but hey, very creative photographer. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. Tonight, we have intriguing new data on how the global pandemic has cut carbon emissions. In early April, daily global emissions were down an estimated 17%. In some countries, at the height of their lockdown, the figure was 26%. The research was compiled by scientists in the US, Europe, and Australia, studying 69 countries. Now, this downward trend will reverse as economies reopen, but 2020 is on track to have a 4 to 7% lower carbon emissions than 2019. So does that mean the dark cloud of COVID-19 may come with a silver lining, an unintended antidote to the planet's big problems? It's a hopeful thought, but things are rarely that simple.
When the world's skies shifted, started to get that much bluer, social media snickering began that maybe humans are the virus and COVID-19 is the vaccine. And it is cautiously tempting to see clearer skies as healthy skies.
Stanford scientists estimate that in some of the most polluted areas, especially in China, it is possible that as many or more lives were saved through the reduction in air pollution than were lost to the pandemic. But that is not to say, under any circumstances, in any ways, that this pandemic is a good thing.
Still, hard to resist hoping for a silver lining in the busy oceans turned silent, for example. Oceanographers know that reduces stress levels in marine life. They've seen this before. Another catastrophe, 9/11, slowed some sea movement so dramatically there was time to see a shift in the whales. So does this rest equal recovery?
Unfortunately, the answer is no, it isn't nearly enough.
Certainly not when it comes to climate change.
We've been putting a brick on a pile every month since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, for the last month, we put a 20% smaller sized brick on that pile that has thousands of bricks already on it. That one slightly smaller brick is not going to make a big difference.
2020 may see the biggest drop in carbon emissions on record, but look at the cost of that. A global economy shuttered. And what if COVID-19 isn't an outlier?
COVID-19 and viruses generally, of course, emerge when we encroach on or mess with nature. We bring species together that shouldn't live so closely together. It becomes a petri dish for virus development.
Figure out a way to sustainably reduce carbon emissions or brace for more viruses.
When we begin to see permafrost melt, there will be a release of things that we can't even begin to imagine. That's why climate action really matters. This dial cannot be dialed back.
These aren't the sunny thoughts those newly blue skies out there hint at, but they are proof human behavior has impact.
For so many of us, we're seeing how there's a different way to do things. Do we really have to commute an hour each way every day? If we can reduce our carbon emissions, if we can reduce the size of the bricks, and then eventually stop putting bricks on the pile altogether, that is the point at which we are going to be able to stabilize our climate.
That kind of change might be hard to imagine, but could you have ever fathomed these changes?
So all of this leaves the Prime Minister in a bit of a tough spot. It is his job to get the economy moving, but there's still that long-term promise to reduce carbon emissions. It is a two-track mission, to be sure. Salima Shivji explains why we only hear about one.
We need to be cautious and responsible.
A constant refrain from the Prime Minister. Whether it's about reopening or that other careful dance, the pandemic hasn't halted. The government's commitment to climate action. It has slipped green policy into some relief plans.
Just because we're in a health crisis doesn't mean we can neglect the environmental crisis.
Help for the oil patches focused on cleanup, and massive loans to large corporations came with climate strings attached.
It is perfectly natural for an investor to be asking people how they are going to manage the risk of climate change in the coming years.
Still, open talk of a green recovery is avoided.
Once we get through this, there will be plenty of time to talk about what the longer term looks like.
With good reason. Justin Trudeau has to walk a tightrope between competing political interests.
Our focus is on getting people back to work in Alberta, not pie-in-the-sky ideological schemes.
Oil is dead.
I don't share that assessment.
Compare the Liberal government's approach to the European Union.
Acceptable figures now?
France and Germany today backing plans for a green roadmap to recovery there. Here, there's a push from outside government, a new independent task force. On it, environmental experts and seasoned political strategists, like Trudeau's former principal secretary and a former policy advisor to Ontario's premier.
My job on the task force is to make sure that I think we keep that economic focus and that real world perspective in check, and we bring it to the table when we're considering environmental positions.
And inside government, there is some talk in very early stages about green recovery ideas. But the dilemma remains, delivering on long-term climate change policies in the timeline promised while managing an immediate crisis. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Ottawa.
You have questions about climate change and COVID-19. Bob McDonald has the answers right after the break.
And later, pushing to reopen faster.
We could have got a lot of work done at this time, I think. And I think we could have done it safely.
We look at why some parts of Ontario are trying to get back to business sooner than the rest.
Hi, I'm Allie. I'm 25 and I live in Toronto. My new normal in COVID-19 involves a lot more time out in the garden because I'm trying to grow a vegetable garden for the first time. So here are all of my seedlings under the grow light, and pretty soon I'm going to be moving them outside, and I'm really excited to see if they grow into vegetables.
These ones are Roma tomatoes, and then there's a cherry tomato right there.
This experience has really made me think a lot more about food insecurity and sustainable food practices. I think that urban gardening and community gardening is a really interesting way to address food insecurity. And I'm hopeful that after COVID-19, these kinds of practices, because I think they've become really popular right now, continue. Here's the garden. Overall, I think this has been a really interesting experience for me. I feel like I've noticed spring in a way that I didn't used to. And it's also made me feel a lot more connected to nature.
So each night on The National, we answer your questions on the coronavirus pandemic. Tonight's focus, the decline in global carbon emissions we told you about before the break. Earlier today, I spoke with our science correspondent, Bob McDonald, to better understand the true impact on climate change. So Bob, I think all of Canada appreciates it when you can cut through the studies and get us to the bottom line. So we have a few waiting for you here.
Yes, let's let the science stand in the forefront here, Adrian.
So first question is, a steep drop in global emissions last month, maybe a 7% decline for all of this year. One viewer has asked us, will Arctic ice, glaciers, and permafrost refreeze because of this reduction in emissions?
Not in the short term, and for two reasons. One is that the carbon dioxide we've already put into the atmosphere will remain in the atmosphere for decades, if not a century. So the warming effect that we're seeing now is going to continue for a long time. It takes a while for carbon dioxide to be absorbed by the oceans or turned into minerals. So it'll be a while before that happens. The other reason is because there are what are called feedback loops happening in the Arctic. When the ice disappears, it exposes dark seawater and dark land. White ice normally reflects sunlight back up into space and keeps us cool. Dark water and dark land absorbs light and turns it into heat. So the water's getting warmer, which will affect ocean currents. And when the land gets warmer, permafrost melts, and all of the organic material that's been frozen there for thousands of years, grasses, shrubs, woolly mammoths, that stuff is exposed, it rots, and then it gives off methane, which is another greenhouse gas even more potent than carbon dioxide. So that's adding to the warming as well. So it'll be a while before the Arctic stops that warming trend and before we start seeing ice growing up there again.
But there is this pause of sorts caused by the pandemic, and one viewer wants to know, is that pause buying us more time to slow climate change?
Well, this pause is an opportunity to look at ourselves and the impact of our technology. You know, those clean air pictures that you were showing earlier are kind of misleading because that smog is produced by gases that come out of tailpipes or the smokestacks of coal-fired generating stations, and they mix with water in the air and make little particles that we can actually see. So when we stopped driving cars around, and when power demands went down, that chemical reaction stopped and all those particles just dropped out of the sky and the air went clear. And it makes it look like, wow, we solved the problem. We can have a blast. But in fact, we're still producing carbon dioxide and methane. And we're going to ramp that back up when the economy comes back on. So those invisible gases are still there. This is time to look at how dirty our technology is when we see how clean it gets when we stop, and to think about where we go from here.
Well, this one, along those lines, this one's a little bit different. We heard a bit about it earlier. Do you think climate change will cause more pandemics?
Well, there's a couple of reasons that is a possibility. As you already heard, there's loss of habitat. We hear about the destruction of the rainforests in Brazil, in Indonesia, and also the wildfires that have been raging through Australia and Western North America. As we destroy habitat, as we move into habitat, there's more crossover between species and them and us. Now, at the same time, as the Earth warms, the climate zones, you know, we have the tropics around the middle, then you have the temperate zones, then you have the Arctic. Those zones are all going to move north so that diseases and viruses that would normally only survive in warm climates can now survive further north because of longer summers, so we are exposed to them more. And you combine all of that with international air travel when it comes back, and it'll be pretty easy for viruses to get around. So it would be foolish for us to think that this is the last pandemic.
I keep looking for a silver lining here. It's getting hard. One last question here is, if you look at the way we've responded globally to COVID-19, what does this tell you about the possibility for a global response to climate change?
Well, here's your silver lining, Adrian. We have seen how we can throw enormous resources, trillions of dollars, at a single problem and how society can respond to that. So let's do the same now for climate change. Let's take resources and put them into cleaner technology. For example, if we all go to electric cars, we're going to need new batteries. The current batteries are really expensive because they're made of rare earth metals. How long can that last? So we need cheap batteries that are made of lightweight material that can charge quickly, and that's one area where we need to research. We need better ways to store energy. Maybe we're going to go to hydrogen. I don't know. There's small nuclear. There are little nuclear power plants that are about the size of an office desk, the kind of thing that are in nuclear submarines, nuclear aircraft carriers that are completely safe. But they could be buried underground and power small towns instead of the big mega plants that we have today. And maybe we can put research into other ways to get energy out of oil, instead of just setting fire to it the way we do now. So let's put our resources towards supporting existing green technology so it's all available to us and we can put solar panels on our roofs, and give this challenge to young scientists in our colleges and universities so they can develop new technologies, things we haven't dreamed of yet, bring them to the forefront, not just on the fringes, and really get on with living in a sustainable way in the future. I believe we can do that.
All right, so much potential ahead. As always, Bob, thank you for your help tonight and keeping us all informed.
Thank you very much, Adrian.
So as we've mentioned, we'll be asking your questions about COVID-19 as often as we can. So please send us the questions you have. Message us directly on Instagram at CBC The National, or send us an email at covid@cbc.ca. Just put The National in the subject line.
And next on The National, speeding up a slow reopening. Should low-risk regions in Ontario with fewer cases be allowed to open up sooner than others? That's right after the break.
First, though, a look at a story we'll bring you tomorrow night, a healthcare experiment in Renfrew, Ontario, that could only have happened in a crisis and might just live beyond. And it's caught the attention of other provinces and other countries.
COVID-19 screen is positive. Over.
The paramedics of Renfrew County might be onto something.
For 559, copy.
There are, of course, the emergencies that always frighten. But there's more.
Hello.
Paramedics. Hello? Look at you with the heat pad on your arm. How are you feeling?
At a time when people cannot see their family doctors but don't all need ERs, paramedics are making house calls, taking blood, putting in IVs, even getting prescriptions filled.
Thank you for having us in your home this morning.
A 24-hour virtual triage system now links doctors and patients and field teams. It's new, and there's a push to keep it post-pandemic.
Can you pull this off in a time when COVID goes away?
We can absolutely continue to provide this level of service.
A ride along into the future, tomorrow on The National.
While provinces are adopting a go-slow approach to reopening during the pandemic, some communities, particularly where the COVID-19 caseload hasn't been as heavy, want to speed things up. David Common went to one to find out why.
And then the bar has been recreated here.
In counting COVID's economic casualties, add Sean Billings' new hotel and bar.
We would have opened on the 8th of May.
After more than a year of renovation, he's been waiting to resume and wishes it had happened sooner.
It's unfortunate because we could have got a lot of work done at this time, I think. And I think we could have done it safely.
Safely because Kingston has seen only a single active case in the past 3 weeks. Amid the closed signs here, questions about whether low-risk regions should have restrictions eased sooner and further than higher-risk areas, while Ontario takes a province-wide approach to easing restrictions.
I'm also hearing from other mayors in the Toronto area that say this is going too fast, that we need to slow down. And I think that contrast, I think, makes the case for at least having a conversation about a regional approach in the province.
One recent study supports an asymmetrical approach. Local reopenings may work best, declares this University of Guelph report. It has not yet been peer-reviewed, but projects a tailored approach results in far fewer days of closure with only slightly more COVID cases, even if others travel in and out of that region.
And I think if we look at the fact we're going to have to live with this virus for the next year and a half, there will be other waves, and those waves may hit different parts of the province in different ways.
Take, for instance, Alberta, where restrictions are also being eased, but less so in Calgary and the city of Brooks, both experiencing higher case levels. Quebec blocked outsider access to certain rural areas while easing restrictions inside them.
I think if you look at the next year and a half,
as Mayor Patterson looks towards a potential second wave, he'd like to be immune from any potential clampdown.
I'm very sensitive to the fact that the Toronto area is facing different conditions than what we're facing out here in Eastern Ontario.
With restrictions now eased across Ontario, Sean's hotel renovation is back on. He'll be able to open. The question is whether to welcome guests from bigger cities.
That's a tough question for me to answer. I'm a hotelier, and I'm always want to serve people, and I'm anxious to serve people. But if it puts into jeopardy the safety of my other guests, if it puts into jeopardy the safety of my staff or myself or my family, I just don't think it'd be a wise decision to make.
Lots of dust.
For now, he's focusing on marketing locally, hoping more people vacation a bit closer to home. David Common, CBC News, Kingston, Ontario.
We will be right back with The Moment. But as we go to break, CBC News is telling the stories of COVID victims through a series we're calling Lives Remembered. Tonight, Peter Wheeland shares memories of his father.
I'm Peter Wheeland. My father was Ken Wheeland. He died of COVID-19 in LaSalle, near Montreal, on April 4th. He was 85 years old. My dad was certainly my hero. No matter what life threw at him, he just dusted himself off and got back up and kept helping other people. He skipped a couple of grades in grade school. He was at the University of Toronto when he was 16, and he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering. He met my mother at a church social and fell in love really quickly. A year later, they were married. When my youngest sister was 3 years old, my mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She was hospitalized, and my father became a single parent for a while with 5 kids at home and a full-time job. It's just a situation that I think very few people would face with the courage and the fortitude that my father did. Of course, because he loved my mother and he loved his family. You always knew that if something happened in your life and you were going to fall, that my father would always be there to make sure that none of us fell very far. 3 of us were able to spend the last 2 days of my father's life at his side, and I wanted him to know how important he had been. And steering me off what could have been like a bad course in my life when I was younger. Anything I've managed to accomplish in the world, I owe to him. And I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life.
So people are finding, well, let's just say creative ways to pass the time they now have on their hands. For an Ontario photographer, that meant finding inspiration from the squirrels in his backyard. Daryl Granger is used to doing some pretty interesting photo shoots, and for this one, he didn't have to leave the backyard, and that is our moment.
We had so much time, like everybody else. We needed to keep the creative juices going. So we were sitting out in the backyard, and it was like, gosh, there's a lot of squirrels back there. Why don't we do something with them? We're used to building sets. I love creating stuff, and I love telling a story through images. That's what I do professionally. You got to keep going. You can't just shut down and let this bad news stuff take over. I even looked on Amazon for a grocery cart that size. And when I find one, I think my last one will be like a weight loss one, because my squirrels are going to be like 3-4 pounds each if they keep eating all the nuts.
So for those folks who wonder, how on earth does he capture these pictures? A lot of ingenuity, creativity, and patience. He gets up at 6 in the morning just with his coffee, just kind of sets up 30 feet away with his long lens, and it takes him hours to get those perfect snaps.
And it gets more complicated because he had to train his dogs not to go squirrel, you know, and head after them. And he's had calls from seamstresses saying, hey, listen, do you need anything sewn for your set? You know, we're here, we can help. So that's just how we roll, it seems, in this country. That is a national for May 19th. Good night.
Good night.